So there, if you go to the sources of Islam, you have Quran and you have Sunnah. If you go to the Quran, you're not going to find a long list of rights that men have or rights that women have. There's no list of like, here are the rights of men and here are the rights of women. You have some verses that kind of specify that, الرجال قوامون على النساء, that men are like the protectors and the maintainers of women, and then therefore they have some rights over others, and just very basic allusions to some of how things are supposed to be going. Then if you go to the Sunnah and you go to Hadith, you'll find this idea of rights, like the word rights in Arabic is huquq or haqq, is like a right of somebody else over somebody else. So this word huquq is actually, it's built into Islam. So it's not that it's a foreign term. So this idea of like having a responsibility or someone having a right over you is built in. So you find, hadith about a Muslim has 5, or another narration, 6 rights over another person. If they sneeze, you respond to their sneeze. When you say salamu alaikum to them, if they die. This is across the board for male and female. So then if you look at hadith, you find many hadith. Some of them talk about this is the right of a wife in Islam, this is the right of a husband in Islam. Famous book written by Imam an-Nawawi, Riyadus Salihin, he has an entire chapter on this. So he has a whole chapter on the rights of women, and when he means women, he means like rights of wives in particular. And then he has a chapter, Babu Haqq az-Zawji ala al-Mar'a, the chapter of the rights of the husband upon the wife. Right? So what rights do a husband have? If you look at the number of hadith that are put in each of these chapters, extremely small. There's only a few hadith in each one. So the amount of rights, meaning like a whole list of like, this is a right in detail, this is what should be done, this is how things should be organized. You don't find things detailed out in Quran or in Sunnah to a great extent. So what you will find in this chapter, you'll find some hadith, like for example, when a man calls his wife to bed and she doesn't respond, then the husband is angry with her, the angels will curse her until the morning. So the right is the right of intimacy, or the right of intercourse, and for a wife to not refuse her husband. The next hadith, you look, it's in the exact same category. A woman should not observe voluntary fasting without the permission of her husband because of his right to intimacy. Look at the next hadith, same thing. One more after. If a man calls his wife out of desire to bed, even if she's occupied on the oven and she's cooking something, she should not refuse him and she should go. So the first, 1, 2, and 4 hadith that are here, they all have to do with intimacy and like physical, non-denial of intercourse and physical intimacy. The third hadith is more general. Most of you probably heard this hadith, that the man is everyone is a shepherd, and the man is a shepherd over his household, and then the woman is a shepherd and in charge of her flock over the family and the kids and things like that. So you'll find a lot of these hadiths mention just a few rights here. So there's the right of intimacy, the generic principle of leadership of a household, but then you have women also being the leadership of responsible over the house itself, not the household, and the children. So then you say, well, what happens when husband wants to make a decision about the kids, but then you say, who's in charge? Who's the shepherd? Is the shepherd the one who's in charge of the whole household? Or are you saying now her temporary, limited domain over this supersedes or overrides because it has to do with the children or whatever? It's not 100% clear cut in the hadith. So what you're going to have is scholars commenting and giving their understanding of what these hadiths mean. And you'll find a few other ones which talk about a woman should not allow anybody into her household that her husband doesn't approve of, right? So you're going to find another hadith like that, which means that's another right of knowing and kind of controlling to an extent who's allowed into the household. And then you're going to get a lot of problems. So, people come to me with a lot of issues in the Muslim community. And I'm surprised because you would think I'm not a trained therapist, right? I'm not a marriage and family counselor. I don't have a degree in counseling or therapy or anything like that. But when I speak to the Muslim counselors who are well known in the Muslim community, and I consult with them on these issues, and I say, you know what? Now, how many cases like this have you gotten? How many cases like this have you gotten? The number of cases that they get is very minuscule. It's very, very small relative to the number of cases that an imam gets, even though they're supposed to be the trained ones. Why do you think that is?
People don't know to approach the counselor. They just
What
want
about the
imam.
religious religiosity card?
It could be. So either they don't know about the counselor, or they don't trust the counselor, or they want to pull a religiosity card, or the most likely thing is whether, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They believe that Islam has the solution, right? They don't believe that secular counseling principles have the same solution that Islam can somehow bring in there, and they don't believe that a counselor usually has Islamic training to the extent of your local sheikh or whatever, right? So it is well known in statistics across the country. Yaqeen did a whole article about it, looking at why people go to imams with their problems, is because they believe and they trust that Islam has the solution for them. And who's their Islamic reference point? It's going to be the local, scholar, whoever it is. So they go and they talk to them, rather than the counselor who got trained by mostly kuffar, and they have some good techniques or whatever, but it's not always grounded within Islamic. All right, good seeing you, man. Sorry, man. We'll send you the video, inshallah, man. So yeah, I encounter a lot of those issues. And what was I talking about? We were just talking about a point.
About
Why they go to a sheikh?
what do you say?
No, one going back before that.
People compare the issues.
Yeah, one going back before that. What was the last thing we were talking about? Subhanallah.
You ask the counselor which question.
The hadith about responsibility in the household and all that, right? So this is a very, very common point of contention. Is that people come in and they say, oh yeah, no, the hadith about inviting into the home. Yeah, the home, yeah, right. So one of the most common complaints is, say, my husband doesn't allow my family members into the house. And then you pull the hadith card and you say, but this is the right, the husband gets to control who's allowed in the house and who's not allowed in the house. And they say another situation, and I'm talking not dozens, okay? I've had hundreds of couples come and tell me that this is exactly the problem. My husband doesn't allow my family into the house, and or my husband doesn't allow me to even talk to my family. Right? So you say, well, there's a hadith there. The husband says, well, I have a right. How do I exercise this right? This is my right to protect my household. Her family's a fitna and she causes so much drama and causes so many problems and all of that stuff. So what it comes back down to is you say, okay, how do you deal with this issue in particular? This issue in particular is, does the husband have a right to control who comes into the household? The answer is absolutely yes, 100%. What happens if the husband is being completely unreasonable and doesn't allow anybody into the household, right? It's like, you know what? Nope, I'm not gonna allow you, to go out with your friends, and because I need you at home for whatever reason. I'm not gonna allow your family to come over. I'm not gonna allow your friends to come over. So the question is, yes, there's a right. And when that right gets abused, if I got 100 complaints about legitimate husbands saying, you know what, her wife is her family is a really big fitna. They come in, they poison the children against the family. This happens a lot. They poison the wife against the husband, and every time the family comes into the household and the mom mom visits for a week and mom leaves, there's trouble in the household for the next 6 months. So the husband's like, next time I just don't want this woman in my house ever again, because she causes so much fitna and drama. Every time wife calls the mom on the phone from across the world, we have problems for a week. We have a fight for a week. And when she doesn't talk to her mom, there's no problem. So this is legitimate. This happens, and this was the underlying reason of the hadith, is that the Prophet ﷺ realized, and he said that the man is responsible for the household, responsible for the protection and safety of the household physically. So if somebody's breaking into the home, if you have a gun, the man is going to get the gun and he's going to go downstairs. And if you don't have a gun, you should see Dr. Adam Wang and join Riverburst and get some training if you need a gun or a baseball bat or whatever it may be. And the man is responsible for doing that. If the car breaks down on the road, somebody needs to walk to the nearest gas station. Who's it going to be? It's going to be husband or the wife? It's going to be the husband. By default, it's going to be the husband. The wife wants to volunteer, and she's a black belt, jiu-jitsu martial artist or whatever, and the guy's like, okay, this was not my field. I'm like in front of a computer. She can volunteer, but the default is going to be the man, because men generally have the physical structure that's different. Everyone understands this. Everyone's complaining about trans women in sports dominating and breaking all the world records in every single thing. So people understand that this is built on the fitrah and the natural disposition of people. So the default rule is the man has a level of control over the protection of the household, and not only physical protection, but he has a responsibility over the mental, psychological protection of the household. And that means there's a lot of fitna, a lot of drama, a lot of things going to be happening. He has a right to have some level of restrictions. So yes, this is a legitimate right. But when this right gets abused to such an extent, you get hundreds of complaints that are legitimate complaints from wives that say, my husband is just being completely unreasonable. My family is not causing a fitna, at least this is her story. My family is not causing a fitna. They don't cause a problem, but he just has a personal grudge against them. They're very supportive. They always speak nicely about him. They never cause any drama. They're not doing anything. But the guy himself has trauma in his own life from his childhood, from his past, from his parents, from his other family, and he becomes so overprotective. He's like, I don't want to talk to them, I don't want to see them, I don't want anybody in my house, I don't want any of your friends in my house, and it just causes also problems for the household. You say, well, how do you resolve this, right? This is where one of the debates comes in. The short answer is, because this is limited session, the short answer is you're gonna do what's called you need a judge. You need a tribunal. You need a Muslim judge. This is what used to happen in the past. So a woman is going to go to court, and she's going to find a Muslim judge, and she's going to present her case and say, the default ruling is that my husband has the right to control who comes into the household. But I'm complaining against my husband that he's abusing his right, and I need somebody who's a neutral third party to evaluate whether he's accurately doing this or not. So you go to a Muslim judge, listens to the case, he listens to both sides of the story, tries to do some investigation, and then he makes a decision. Is the husband doing this correctly, or is he abusing his rights, and there's going to be an override of his jurisdiction or his power? And this used to happen in the past. This is what needs to happen in the past, right? Unfortunately, it's a very long and involved process. I only give people 15-minute appointments now because I don't have time to sit with all these cases. So two people come to me, husband says, okay, and I'm going to present my side, wife's going to present the side. Say, fine, you get 5 minutes, and I get 5 minutes to make a decision. It's not going to work. You need a longer process than that, right? So this, I think, is the correct balance, and this is what Islam is teaching, that there's a default principle. When the principle is being abused, there needs to be an override that happens. Same thing when it happens to marriage. When you're supposed to have a wali, you're supposed to have a woman has a wali. When the wali or the father or the grandfather, whoever it is, if they are being unjust and not allowing their daughter to get married, and for absolutely ridiculous reasons, right? You say, well, what do you do in this case? How do you get married? Either follow the fatwa of Imam Abu Hanifa, which doesn't require wali, or you do a wali override, which means you will go to a judge. It's kind of like actually suing your own, relative, your father or your uncle or whoever your wali is, but not suing them in a bad way, but basically saying, I want someone to verify whether they're abusing their rights or not. So if a woman is in love with some guy and he wants to get married, and the parents are like, no, we're not going to allow that, this is a really bad guy and whatever it is, that's a different case than a woman who comes, and there's hundreds of cases. Woman who comes and says, Sheikh, I have literally seen 30 guys. I'm hitting age 40. My parents refuse every single guy. I would have been willing to marry any one of these guys, and my parents always refuse every single one of these guys. I'm almost 40. I'm not going to be able to have kids anymore. What do I do? How am I going to ever get married? That's the case of a legitimate wali override. That's going to happen, and there needs to be a process for that. So that is one of the rights that men have, and there's a process that you go through in order to get that right overridden. Rather than simply saying, well, look, there's so many husbands who abuse that right, and therefore we should somehow either discredit the hadith, it's an authentic hadith, or we should just say, you know what, this is not fair and we think there's a problem with Islam or whatever it is. But we don't have many of those systems in place to be able to provide that level of mediation or arbitration or adjudication of a judge process or something like that. So that's one other aspect. The other aspect I wanted to talk about was what the brother mentioned about community property. So California is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. As most of you know, right? California and New York, property rates are ridiculously high. Part of the reason why they're so high, does anyone know? Anyone want to put a theory of, outside of the weather, why is it so expensive to live in California? Any theories? Huh? What do you work? The jobs are, they pay a lot or they pay a little or what?
There's a lot of jobs available.
So therefore the prices go up because people are making money. Is that why? Okay, that's maybe one reason. You can make a lot more money in California, therefore you can afford more and the housing prices go up. There's another reason. I heard a whisper over here.
Supply of housing is choked.
Supply of housing is
Choked.
choked. Why is it choked?
There's a lot of rules about when you can build, when you cannot build. There's a lot of the residents don't like building new housing. being
Okay,
built.
so that plays a role. Anything else? Any other variable?
Just two things. One is like geography plays in here because of the mountains and limited land availability and dual income.
There you go. So that's what I was gonna say. Dual income households. So if you look at California, has one of the highest rates of dual income households. What that means is husband and wife both work and they share their money, which means that if they're sharing their money and they're gonna live in one house, they can put in way more money than a single family household. So they're gonna be bidding on properties and they're gonna bid up whatever their loan or their bid, and the prices, because people are willing to pay a lot more and they can afford a lot more, now prices will just keep on going up. So if you have high dual income households, this is what's going to happen naturally. So now the question is, if this is kind of what the brother was asking, is that he grew up in American culture, he probably grew up in California culture or something similar. The understanding of the average young person who's like under 40 is that dual income household is the default. And if it's the default, then that means you're also sharing expenses. So there's a lot of discussion within forums about, even when people are dating and non-Muslims and they're dating and stuff like that, who should be paying for the dinner, right? So they say, we're going to split 50-50, or you get dinner one time, we get dinner the next time. From a traditional perspective, you say, what are you talking about? That's not the way that it works. Even in non-Muslim traditional culture, the man is going to pay for the bill. Who's going to pay for the rent if they're renting a place and they want like a nicer place or whatever? So the default now is, we're going to pay 50-50. We both work, we both have income and all of that stuff. So what happens now is there's this confusion. You got, on the one hand, this is the default that people are living in. The cost of living is ridiculously high relative to what it used to be in the past. And then you have the traditional understanding of Islam that says man is responsible for all of the expenses in the marriage. So what does all of the expenses in the marriage in the time of Medina, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, entail? That entails, how many square feet was the Prophet ﷺ's house, or his house, little houses for the women? Does anyone know approximately?
So
one room, so
200?
800.
200 square feet?
800?
I guess.
800 is your guess?
200. 200. Less than 200.
Between 100 to 150 square feet. That's my calculation based on the hadith, and I just did measurements and everything, and it's a hadith about Aisha and how he stood up and you could almost hit the ceiling when you stand up and all that stuff. It's about 100 to 150 square feet, right? What's in there? There's no electricity, there's no gas, there's no this, there's no that, there's no health insurance, there's no, all the bills that we have that rack up, there's none of those expenses are there, right? So now you say, well, what is the husband's responsibility today when he says you have to pay for the wife's expenses, right? So you have the housing, but then you say, well, with housing comes electricity, with that comes gas, with that comes renter's insurance or home insurance, with that comes medical insurance, with that comes dental insurance, with that comes this, and you say, well, cell phone is a necessity today, and therefore it must be included, and internet bill is a necessity today, and that's broadband and maybe fiber or something like that, and car is a necessity today, and auto insurance is a necessity today, and gas is a necessity today, and it just adds up. So the way in which this was being perceived was completely different, right? On a completely different level. So this is where a lot of the confusion comes, and they say, well, wait a minute, okay, on the one hand, if I have to cover all of these expenses, what is the level of the expenses that I need to cover? So they go back to the verse in the Quran. And the verse in the Quran basically says, talking more about in the terms of divorce, about how much can a person afford. He said everyone is supposed to pay based upon their social status or their financial status. So a person who is wealthy is going to give more, and a person who has less is going to give less. So no one is going to be wronged. No one is going to be asked to give more. No one's going to be asked to give less than what they actually make or their income or whatever it is. So there's some basic principles in the Quran that mention those things. So, but it's still very general and it's vague, and there's a lot of room for interpretation and application. So what happens now, you say, well, how are we supposed to structure marriages today when the default, so there's three ways, there's three main explanations that I think people give when they're explaining what is Islam's role. One explanation is that a husband is responsible for all the expenses of the household, and the wife, in exchange for that, is going to be responsible for taking care of the household, like was mentioned in the hadith. And the household means raising the children, making sure the house is clean, cooking, cleaning. That means no need for a maid, right? That means that, educating the children, that means like assuming they're being homeschooled, for example, she's going to be responsible for all of the education of the children and everything. So you say, okay, well, if the guy's going to be working an average 40, 50 hours per week, and he's paying for all the expenses of whatever that may be, what is the flip side to that? The flip side is all of these things, and therefore they're going to balance each other out, right? This is one view, right? The second view, which you will hear, unfortunately, from some people, is they say, well, no, we have Islamic scholars who have said in traditional books of fiqh, one of two things. One is that a wife has no responsibilities in the household. Her only right, based on the hadith, is be available for intercourse. She cannot refuse that. But in terms of her right, like her responsibilities, she doesn't have household responsibilities. She doesn't need to cook. She doesn't need to clean, because in that culture they had servants who were doing most of these things. So this is one view you'll find among some of the scholars in the books. Another view you'll find is not only does she have none of those responsibilities, the husband has a responsibility to hire a servant or a slave, at the time slavery, servant, to do all of these chores, so that the woman has somebody who's going to be helping her with those things. And then you have some scholars mention these type of things. So you'll find some Muslim speakers and some scholars who promote this opinion. And the underlying reason, my view, is why they're promoting this opinion. And I've spoken to some of them behind closed doors, and I said, why do you prefer this opinion rather than the first one that I just mentioned about, hey, there's a balance between all of these things? And they say, there's such a massive attack on women in Islam. We need to show that Islam is good. We need to show that, Islam is fair and all of that stuff. And people always think like Islam oppresses women and this and that. And sometimes they say, well, that's my madhab, so I go with what the books of my madhab say. Or sometimes they say, no, we take that opinion because it's going to make Islam look better, and it's going to make Islam look nicer, and then, people are attracted to that. And a lot of people, when they're talking to non-Muslims, and they're like, hey, why you should consider Islam? They're like, you know what? Women in Islam, they're like princesses. You come in, you don't have to pay for anything. The guy's going to pay for everything. You're going to be treated like a queen. And you're like, people are like, wow, that's amazing. Like, Islam is so great, has so many rights for women, blah, 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 blah. So they go ahead and they promote that view. Now the question is what's the, number one, is that a fair view, right? Is that there's something called the rajih view. Tarjih means when there's a difference of opinion among scholars, classical scholars, you're going to prefer one opinion over another opinion. I need to send a text message real quick. So they're going to prefer one opinion over another. Why do you prefer one opinion over another? You should either do it because there's an extreme level of hardship that's going to be involved, or because you just generally view that opinion as being what was really representative, what Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam really wanted people to do, right? So you can pick, people have different opinions on, distance for traveling, and whether you wipe over socks, and whether you do this, whether you do that. How do you pick? You don't just pick based upon what feels good. You pick based upon what you think is the most legitimate, most authentic, and sometimes you could pick a view that you think is a little bit weaker, but because there's a massive need, like, that has to be done. Like, let's say praying Jummah, starting Jummah prayer before the time comes in. This is a Hanbali view. Now in America, I insist we don't need to do that because there's no need over here. But in like France, we were talking about France, it's horrible. Like you can barely get time off of work. You can't do it. It's like Muslims will be really in a very difficult situation if they, in certain months, if they don't follow this opinion. So in something like that, it's understandable why they picked that. My personal view is that this is it's a very unfair opinion. It was based on a culture that existed at the time where people had servants. You go to like Singapore. Like I just met some people from Singapore. They have servants there. You go to Pakistan, they have servants there. That's a culture where like the servants have servants, right? And it's not very expensive to have these servants, and they're going to be cooking and cleaning, and that's the culture over there. The culture over here is not that. The culture over here is many people are barely surviving. They have to pay a maid. They have to, do this, and they have to pay for like every single thing. Oh, great. So the scholars were writing based upon their culture 1,000 years ago, the way things were. All right, that's not always the way it was. And then they say, well, look at this example, or look at this example. Look at the example of Fatima and Ali, right? She was working so hard, her hands were getting blistered. She asked the Prophet ﷺ for a servant, and he's like, no, there are people who are in more need. I'll teach you zikr instead. I mean, it was not an easy lifestyle, right? So I think my personal view is that the reason why people push this opinion, if they really, really believe this intellectually, with all due respect, alhamdulillah. But I believe they're pushing it because they're constantly on the defensive and they're trying to show Islam is nice and this and that. But it also creates a ton of resentment to the Muslim community, particularly to Muslim men who have to deal with the situation. They come home every day and they're like, just like the brother said, he's like, I work 50 hours. If you ask non-Muslim, feminist, psychologists, that was one lady I talked to, she's PhD, her name is Dr. Ray. She's like self-identified feminist psychologist, and she's like, I'm talking about, these are some of the issues that I get with people and everything, and she's like, it bothers me so much. So we have the same thing. In the non-Muslim community, same issues. She says, I tell my clients that if there's a dual income household, if the guy's working 50 hours a week and the woman works 25 hours a week, when he comes home, before you ask him to pick up any dishes, women complain, they're like, a guy comes home and he's gonna sit in front of the TV and he wants his beer. This is a non-Muslim culture, right? I want my beer and I'm gonna sit in front of the TV and I'm gonna do this. So she's telling me, non-Muslim feminist counselor, and she's like, what I tell my clients is that there has to be basic fairness and principle. So I tell my clients, whoever's complaining, usually women, that when he comes home, he worked 50 hours, you work 25 hours, you have joint income, he's gonna sit on the sofa, he's gonna drink his beer, he's gonna watch his TV, and you're not gonna ask him to pick up a dish, you're not gonna ask him to wash the baby, give the baby a bath or something like that, until you've racked up throughout the week the additional 25 hours of housework, so that you actually are on an equal playing field. Which means that non-Muslims understand this principle. And that's where the brother was coming to say, if we already have a model where there's a joint property ownership model, and there's egalitarian marriages where everything is 50-50, we say in Islam, well, no, that's not the default, we don't follow that. But what happens is, we end up going to another opposite extreme and say, well, what is the other side? Other side is man is responsible for everything, and if we take this fiqh position, and this fiqh position says, the woman is responsible for nothing. We're in a completely opposite extreme. And that's why I think it's very dangerous to follow this opinion. The opinion that we should be following is this other one over here. All right. My little spiel on this. Any quick questions before I have to get going?
So going back, going back to the actual, we go back home after this meeting, right?
Yeah.
Like we're not gonna start giving a lecture to our wife that, hey, clean the dishes, right?
That's why I said I will not sufficiently cover the topic, but I will cover the topic.
Are you on recording?
It's fine. It's fine. You can put on YouTube.
Saying, like in terms of just hikmah, right? What type of hikmah would you suggest going back?
So yes, very good question. In terms of hikmah, so number one, I want you to basically understand this principle in your mind, right? And you should always, first of all, look into yourself and say, what are my shortcomings, right? What are my shortcomings? Am I fulfilling my role as a husband properly? You say, okay, let's say you work and you make the money. But you also have other responsibilities as a husband. You have to have good character, you have to have good akhlaq, don't lose your temper, don't do banning the family for no reason from the household or whatever it is. So you need to do your part, and you need to make sure you do your part. And usually I know a lot of lectures will just simply stop and say, just focus on your part. And that's very frustrating. It's like, well, where's the other part? The other part is you need to put some boundaries in place. There's fantastic books on boundaries. I can look them up for you real quick. Let's see. There's 3 books or 2 main books that I recommend. One of them is called Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Glover Tawwab. She's probably not even Muslim, I don't know, but she got the word Tawwab. Maybe she'll make Toba. But it's a very secular book, but it's a very good book. So Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And there's another very famous book called Boundaries by Henry Cloud. So these are really good books. So what setting boundaries means, some people, who's heard the word set your boundaries? Has anyone heard this term before? You've heard it? Where'd you hear it? From a therapist or from a work? Okay,
They
mashallah.
tell the kids in school that, personal boundaries, set boundaries.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't know what it means exactly, right? So it's important to understand. So in
Is
the
it kind of like stay in your lane type of?
No,
or
no. See, that's why it's a lot of confusion. When I first heard boundaries, like maybe 5-6 years ago or something, I didn't understand what it meant exactly either. Setting your boundaries basically means that you say, okay, now that I've understood that I have rights and responsibilities, these are also my rights, and I don't want you to be trampling on my rights all the time, because you're telling me to be the martyr. You're telling me to sacrifice everything, and I should let go of all of my rights that I have, and I'm going to keep on doing responsibilities. So setting your boundaries basically means like, listen, if you're going to have this type of behavior, it's not going to be acceptable to me. If you do this type of behavior, I'm going to walk away. Or if you do this type of behavior, I'm gonna, not. Let's say, boundaries with your uncle who's being mean to you. You want to visit your uncle. You want to maintain family relations. Say, uncle, you always like gossip and backbite about people. I'm tired of that. Or you always use bad language when I bring my kids over. I don't want my kids to be listening to cuss words. I'm setting a boundary with you. You're my family. I love you, but I want you to stop cussing around my kids. The boundary is, when I bring my kids over for 1 hour once a month, there will be no cussing for that hour. If you cross, it's a boundary I'm setting, I'm making it very clear to you. If you cross the boundary, next month's visit will be canceled, and I'll see you again the following month, because you crossed the boundary. You need to set a boundary. You need to follow through on the boundary, because if you set a boundary and then you don't follow through, the person's going to break your boundary even more. So this is very important. So setting some boundaries, figuring out, hey, find out first of all, what's a good boundary to set, and say, this is my expectation, this is my right, this is my expectation, this is why I believe it's correct. We can discuss it before I set it, and then say, this is what I would like to see happen. And if it doesn't happen, this is the consequence, reasonable consequence. This is the consequence that's going to happen as a result of that. That's what I think you should start at least planning to do. So right now we haven't gone through a full discussion. At least think about what are legitimate boundaries that you could set in your own relationships that are within the framework of Islam. I think that's a fair thing to do.
And just let her set her boundaries.
And let her set her own boundaries as well. And say, I want you to set your own boundaries as well. And let's discuss it. And maybe, we can compromise on the boundaries before we set them. So we come up with them together. And we say, this is my expectation. This is what I would like to see happen. Inshallah. Yeah. You had a question, or you just the hair? Yeah.
I would like to add something. When you have a children, the situation is totally different too, because you have to take into effect what will happen to the children, and it's always, not I'm right and she's wrong. Okay, I will carry some burden of this. That's fine, just to maintain the family until the children are grown and have the discipline and everything. Absolutely, with time, keep trying to reach the suitable ground, but not to come to the break point and break the family. It's, unfortunately, we used to see this divorce. I remember in my life, my sister would have a hard time with her husband when she comes home. And the one that ran the entire house, my grandfather, he doesn't say a word. She takes the dinner with us, and he take her to her house and say, the problem between you and your husband, you guys have to discuss it. We don't want to get involved and tell us something.
So, which actually brings me to another point, is that one of the challenges of a lot of families is that the the greater family unit is really not there. So it takes like a village to raise a child, and like for many families, the family's not there because people have moved over to a different place for work or whatever it is. So they don't have a lot of support system. So that caused a lot of conflict as well. So take one last comment or question, and then I gotta get going.
I got a quick one. So, do you have any stats on dual income households outside of California? Like,
You could Google it very quickly. It actually lists the data state by state.
okay,
Which ones are
but
dual
there is a
income.
lot of variation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It's as far as I recall, California is one of the highest. And then, which by the way, so
But does that cause the increase, or was it because of the?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Like, is it
yeah,
the cause or the effect?
it's hard to know which one.
Self-perpetuating cycle.
I would say it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Which, by the way, I wanted to address that point. So the question is, having a dual income household and having an agreement where you have an egalitarian marriage, is that even allowed in Islam? Right? Is that the default in Islam, and is it allowed in Islam? And I think the answer is, everyone says that, scholars will say, it is allowed in Islam to make a contract which you both mutually agree to. So if you want to have your marriage that way, you can have your marriage that way. The problem really with most cases is people don't know what their marriage is exactly, right? And even according to law, people don't understand like who owns what property and what's going to happen and all that. And only when there's death or divorce, now it's like, well, what's going to happen? Which property? Who owns what asset? And it just becomes an absolute chaos and a huge mess. And part of the reason why it's a huge mess is because nobody wants to discuss or talk about what belongs to whom throughout the period of the marriage. And even the law, people misunderstand the law. Many scholars misunderstand the law. They say, you know what? Well, everything is owned 50-50. That's actually not true. So in California, everything is owned 50-50 only when there's death or divorce. You don't own 50-50. So if a guy makes $1 million and the wife makes $100,000, when they get their paycheck from work, does it come in both of their names? Is it 50-50? No. If the guy goes and gets his $1 million paycheck and says, you know what, I'm going to buy myself a McLaren, right? Can the wife say, hey, 50% of that money is mine? You can't do that. She can't. But you know what she can do? She can file for divorce and take 50% of the McLaren. So she only gets 50% if she files for divorce or if he dies. She does not own 50% even according to the law while they remain married. And that causes so much confusion among people. So what does that mean? So how are things divided? Property is separated during the marriage. Property automatically is assumed. It's called the community property assumption. Property gets divided only upon death and divorce. So that causes a lot of confusion. So you say, can you make a contract in advance about what's going to happen in this case and children and all that? Yes, you can Islamically. And yes, you can legally. But who's going to put all of those clauses in? People don't even know. They say, well, what should the clause be? Nobody knows. I've spoken to 100 scholars and asked them, what should we make a standard prenuptial agreement for the Muslim community? At least give me two options. Option one, you could pick egalitarian marriage. Option two, you could pick traditional marriage. How should we word it, and what should we put in terms of detail? Nobody has the answer because it's so relative, right? So I think there needs to be, my ideal is to make a standard prenuptial agreement or postnuptial agreement where whenever we do nikah in the masjid, we give two options. Option number one, egalitarian marriage, because you're both working and you don't plan on having kids, or let's say, you can't have kids or whatever it is. Option number two, traditional marriage. What does that mean? What does egalitarian marriage mean, and what does traditional marriage mean? It's not clearly defined, and there needs to be at least some clear-cut things, and you say you can pick whichever one you want, but at least whenever you pick it, you realize that in case something happens, if you die or divorce, you're responsible for what you signed and you knew what you were doing. Biggest problem today is nobody knows what's going to happen. One person is thinking, no, it's a traditional marriage. Other person's thinking, no, I was told I can get egalitarian marriage. I was told I can get this. And it happens to women too. I have women coming to me, doctors, dentists. She makes like $200,000. Guy's a lazy bum. He makes almost nothing. And she's sitting there complaining, say, he's claiming 50% of my property. I've been working and I helped take care of most of the kids. And now he's claiming all this money from me and saying, well, the sheikh said it's okay, law of the land, 50-50. It's not right. So we have a problem. We don't have the exact solution, but this is kind of like a framework for, I think, what the solution should be. Inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. To be continued, inshallah.